So before we get started, I'm just going to warn you there might be a little bit of background noise. It's a nice night. My windows are open, so you might hear some cars or some stuff from my neighbors. Anyway, with the recent reveal of Microsoft's Project Scorpio's technical specs over at Eurogamer's Digital Foundry, the PC versus console debate is heated up once again, especially with E3 just a few weeks away. Microsoft is alleging they can get 2160p video, otherwise known as 4K, at 60 frames per second on their upcoming console. There are some that feel that this will make it not as worth it to get themselves a high-end PC, and we'll go over if a high-end PC is something worth getting in a bit. But that's an ongoing issue, since PCs tend to outperform consoles, and especially in this generation, the PC market was well outperforming both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in terms of graphical fidelity and frames per second before they even launched. Even now, Sony's PS4 Pro falls short of top-end enthusiast level, but still consumer-grade graphics cards of the last graphics card generation, like the GTX 980 Ti and the RX 290X. The PS4 Pro has 4.1 teraflops of performance, while both of those cards had 5.63 teraflops of performance. And the PS4 Pro only just beats out the extremely popular GTX 970's 3.9 teraflops. Project Scorpio is boasting 6 teraflops of performance, which is higher than the 980 Ti and 290X, but still lower than the newer GTX 1070's 6.5 teraflops. Now, while I'm not a benchmarking guy, I don't go out and benchmark graphics cards and such. Others who are benchmarking enthusiasts have shown that a single GTX 1070 is not a 4K 60 frames per second card at max settings, at least not for a lot of games. While it can hit 4K 30 frames per second in a lot of games at high settings, a single 1070 is not considered a 4K 60 FPS max settings card for most PC enthusiasts, especially running the newest AAA games. It is considered a 1440p gaming card and an absolute beast at destroying 1080p game frame rates at max settings. Yet, Microsoft is saying they can get a native 4K 60 FPS on Project Scorpio. Microsoft is saying they've done a lot of optimization to Project Scorpio to do this, but I have a feeling that, even so, most games won't be running at the equivalent of max settings on the PC at a native 4K resolution and hit 60 frames per second. Even on the PC side of things, the only sub-$1,000 single graphics card that has a greater chance of hitting native 4K and 60 FPS at max settings is the recently released GTX 1080 Ti, which runs at 11.3 teraflops, or almost double that of Project Scorpio. And even so, some games still can't hit that on a single 1080 Ti. I know Digital Foundry said they saw the Forza engine running at 60 frames per second 4K native at PC Ultra settings on Project Scorpio. But we have to remember that the Forza engine is already extremely optimized for the original Xbox One hardware, which Digital Foundry admitted. It is not a guarantee that every engine will be able to do the same thing, since most third-party game engines aren't specifically optimized just for the Xbox One architecture. So I wouldn't go getting your hopes up that Project Scorpio will be able to do every game at 4K 60 FPS at PC Ultra settings. The far safer bet is to assume equivalent to PC Medium to PC High, or some mix of those two in effect, especially from third-party games. Microsoft Studio games may be able to get better settings, but we have to remember that those studios are already making games specifically optimized for the Xbox One hardware. So, is the PS4 Pro or Project Scorpio the way to go? Or is a high-end PC the way to go? Honestly, that's going to differ for each person out there. I'm not here to tell you which one you should get, but I hope I can break down some of the pros and cons of console and PC gaming, and give you an idea of the cost to move up to 4K gaming on both platforms. I'm going to be honest here. While I do believe that 4K gaming will become a bigger issue in the future, I don't think that trend is going to be happening right now. The vast majority of gamers, be they console or PC gamers, aren't yet on 4K displays. Most of us are still on 1080p displays, and a chunk of PC gamers are on 1440p displays. The 4K display adoption rate on both the TV and PC monitor side, while it is increasing, hasn't hit a critical mass just yet. Obviously, as companies phase out 1080p displays on TV screens larger than 40 inches in favor of 4K ones, this will start to change. The reason for the lack of adoption is threefold. First, the price, while it has come down, is still very high for 4K displays. The second being that many of us are just fine with our 1080p TVs and monitors right now, until the prices and response times come down even further. A lot of us have decent 1080p TVs and or PC monitors, and there isn't a huge incentive for us to upgrade at the present time. On the TV side of things, the 4K content just isn't out there in large enough numbers to warrant a lot of people to ditch their 1080p TVs and jump up to 4K. On the PC side, the price per inch for 4K monitors is excessively high, especially for monitors with a good response time, which is necessary for fast-paced gaming. As for people video editing and such, unless they're already editing 4K video, they don't really have a reason or the need to upgrade to 4K monitors. The final and biggest reason is that there is no mandate from the government to move to 4K resolution. While the Xbox 360 and the PS3 are often credited with the faster adoption rate of 1080p TVs, this is only partially true. 720p and 1080p TVs had already been around for a while, and the 360 and the PS3 did take advantage of them. However, the consoles were never the reason that the mainstream moved to digital TVs. That was the governments of the world. Going back as far as 1997, in the case of Vietnam, governments began mandating that all broadcast TV stations switch over to digital by certain dates. This was done to free up more of the analog radio spectrum in these countries, especially after some TV stations began broadcasting some HD content over the air, which took up a large amount of bandwidth on the analog spectrum. So in the US, for example, all broadcast TV stations had to be broadcasting in both analog and digital on September 8, 2008, and had to cease broadcasting analog by June 12, 2009. Because the government mandates on switching over to digital broadcasting, TV networks had the incentive to change their programming to HD formats. Also, it gave the general populace a reason to upgrade to 720p and 1080p TVs with digital tuners, over gutting the digital to analog converter boxes. This time around, there is no mandate to move to 4K or better resolutions, so the broadcast and cable TV networks have very little incentive to move over to the much more expensive 4K cameras, or broadcast over the air at 4K, which eats into more of their allotted bandwidth. So since 4K content isn't being made en masse, and the government isn't mandating that everything move to 4K, the mainstream adoption rate is predictably slower. As it currently stands, the 4K TV adoption rate in the US is only at around 15% of US households, and that isn't expected to hit 50% until the end of 2019. Even still, the PS4 Pro, which Sony has touted as a 4K gaming console, has very few titles that hit a native 4K resolution. Some sports games and some remasters, like The Last of Us Remastered, essentially a PS3 game, and some indie titles are hitting a native 4K resolution on the PS4 Pro. Most of the rest of the titles are being checkerboard rendered to 4K from a lower resolution, like 1440p or 1800p, including the recently released Horizon Zero Dawn, with a few, like Uncharted 4, only displaying at 1440p. Now, both Sony and Microsoft have not mandated that developers have to render at a native 4K resolution. They've left it up to developers to decide. So yes, we will see checkerboard renders or direct upscaling on Project Scorpio as well. It's going to be left in the hands of developers if they want a checkerboard render, directly upscale, or to produce their games at a native 4K. If your favorite console game isn't native 4K on the PS4 Pro or Project Scorpio, then know it was the developer's choice not to make the game in that resolution. But not every PC game renders at native 4K either. Again, the developers have control over what resolution they make their games. There are far more native 4K games, however, than in the console space. So, since the PC has more games at native 4K, that's obviously the place to be, right? Well, that's going to depend. Do you have a 4K capable PC? Are you willing to spend the money to upgrade your PC or to build one from scratch that is 4K capable? Are your friends playing on PC? These are questions you need to be willing to answer. But before we look at 4K gaming, let's look at the type of gaming most of us are going to be doing for the immediate future. 1080p gaming. Currently, a fairly cheap PC and both the base PS4 and Xbox One can do 1080p gaming. Granted, not every game on the consoles currently runs at 1080p, with the PS4 having more games that do hit 1080p natively than the Xbox One, but both consoles are capable of doing it. But here we have the first advantage of consoles: price. The barrier to entry for console gaming, price-wise, is fairly low. The Xbox One S starts at $250, and the base PS4 starts at $300. Assuming you don't need a 1080p TV, these are the base prices, plus game costs, and the cost of Xbox Live Gold and PlayStation Plus if you want to play online on your consoles. If you do need a 1080p TV, 40-inch versions tend to go for around $250 for name brands right now. Prices go up as the size of the TV increases, and if it is a smart TV, obviously. On the PC side, the price is a bit higher. Paul's Hardware recently built two 1080p capable PCs, one for $500 and one for $750, and I'll link to the video where he tells you the frames per second and settings each was able to achieve in a few games. I will go ahead and spoil that the $500 PC, while it could hit 1080p resolution, was unable to maintain or even reach, in some cases, a minimum of 60 FPS at max settings. While it could do 1080p 60 FPS, most of the game's settings had to be reduced to achieve 60 FPS. The $750 PC, on the other hand, was able to hit 1080p and at least 60 FPS at max or near max settings on most of the games tested. Now, comparatively speaking, a $750 PC isn't a high price tag, especially considering that if somebody really went out of their way, they could make a PC that costs thousands of dollars. Whether or not a PC of that price is worth it is subjective. It's also worth mentioning that not everything has to be bought at the same time when building a PC. Parts may be bought piecemeal at any point. This enables people to spread out the buying of PC parts to when they can afford them or when they're on sale. Also, if a 1080p monitor is needed, a 24 to 28 inch 144 Hz 1 millisecond response time non-FreeSync, non-G-Sync monitor is in the neighborhood of around $250. And for the record, using a 1080p TV is not recommended as a monitor replacement. Text is often blurry, and the 1080p TVs still have generally higher response times than a PC monitor. So assuming that no TV or monitor is required, the consoles have a definite price advantage, but cannot be bought in pieces. Now, when we are discussing the price advantage of consoles, it would be remiss of me to not mention why consoles have such a price advantage. The answer is, honestly, that for the most part, consoles use older technology when they are released. Yes, there are exceptions, like the PS3's cell processor, which was a processor that Sony, Toshiba, and IBM worked on. A brand new piece of hardware at the time that, while powerful, ended up being much harder for developers to develop for than it needed to be. The current generation is a great example of this. Both the PS4 and the Xbox One were developed a few years before they were released. Essentially, both consoles were using 2010 to 2011 technology when they were released in 2013. The AMD Jaguar cores that both consoles use, and that their upgraded mid-generation refreshes also use, are fairly old in tech terms. Despite any modifications and customization they might be using, the core of the CPU is older tech. The same goes for the GPUs both consoles used. They weren't anywhere near close to even mid-range GPUs in 2013, and were closer to high-end graphics cards from 2010. The PS4 did have a more modern version of RAM by using GDDR5 RAM, while the Xbox One still used DDR3 RAM. Because consoles generally use older tech, it helps keep the cost to manufacture them down, and thus able to not lose as much per console at launch, or to even potentially be able to make a profit per console at launch. Nintendo is well known to try and sell their consoles at a small profit at launch, while Sony and Microsoft are more willing to make their consoles loss leaders, losing some money per console, and then making that money up with game sales and the licensing fees paid to them by publishers. Even the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio will be following these trends. The PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio are still using Jaguar CPUs. Even though they are modified, the tech is still Jaguar. However, they are moving to slightly newer GPUs by using AMD's Polaris architecture. Again, these GPUs are modified, and they do contain some amount of Vega improvements. But the Polaris series of GPUs is AMD's budget line of graphics cards. So the GPU tech is far newer, being released just last year. But it's not the next big high-end enthusiast GPU from AMD, which is Vega. And since Polaris is a budget line, buying in bulk for Sony and Microsoft keeps the cost down. On the PC side, even using newer tech can be somewhat comparable in price. As the $500 PC Paul's Hardware build showed, it isn't using 2-generation-old CPUs or GPUs, but just the lower-powered, more affordable versions of much more recent tech. The CPU in the $500 build is only 1 generation old, using the 6100 series of i3 processors, and the GPU is the extremely affordable RX 460 version of AMD's 2016 release of its Polaris GPUs. It is using DDR4 RAM, which has only recently become the standard for even budget-oriented builds. Now, when moving up to the massively powerful 4K builds, obviously the technology used is current generation tech, pretty much bleeding edge in terms of consumer class hardware. We're talking about a graphics card released in just the past month or so, and the very newest and fastest consumer i7 processors. Before we move into 4K gaming, I'd like to point out that even if one is still gaming at 1080p, but is using a console or PC capable of outputting at 4K, they're not left in the dust. All modern PC GPUs and the mid-generation refresh consoles support what is known as super sampling. The basic gist is that the games will be rendered at a higher resolution with better textures, and then downsampled to the output resolution. This helps make the 1080p version look better, as the higher resolution render improves the aliasing, or jaggies, at 1080p, as well as texture appearances. While it's not always a fix that would make 1080p games have straighter lines without anti-aliasing enabled, it does help in that regard. So, to save GPU power that would otherwise be allocated to anti-aliasing, a game could be rendered at 4K, then downsampled to 1080p with no anti-aliasing turned on, and the game would still look better than the normal 1080p version without anti-aliasing enabled. As an example, my Diablo 3 renders at 4K and is super sampled down to 1080p, but Diablo 3 is a game from 2012 as well. The benefits to GPU power saving might not be as apparent on newer titles. Also, the rendering and better textures at 4K themselves do draw more of the GPU's total power, so it's not exactly a perfect solution, but it is a definite improvement over native 1080p rendering. When we're talking about moving to higher resolution gaming, i.e. 4K gaming, the price goes up drastically. Yes, even for console gaming. 4K displays, both TVs and PC monitors, are still relatively expensive at the present time. For instance, if we look at Ratings.com's best 4K TVs for gaming, their best budget TV for spring 2017, as rated by them, is still around $650. The best mid-range TV is $1,200, and the best high-end TV is $2,300. All these prices are as listed on Amazon at the time of this recording for the smallest screen size of those TVs. The price goes up as the screen size increases. Just to mention it, I also found a Samsung 88-inch curved 4K TV for $20,000 on Newegg. It should be mentioned, though, that most 4K TVs on the market are not made with gaming in mind. Many of the higher-end 4K TVs, and even the not-so-high-end ones, have higher response times than are wanted for many fast-paced games, like shooters and racing games. Some of them do have lower response time game mode that can be activated, but even then the response times are fairly high. Also, not all of them support HDR, High Dynamic Range Color, in game mode. Both the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio support HDR10, but not all of the 4K TVs on the market right now will utilize this in game mode. Manufacturer firmware updates have been changing this, though. Also, HDR being enabled on these TVs is known to increase the response times even further. I should mention that I did find a very cheap 49-inch 4K TV by a brand I've never heard of. That was only $300. But I would say buyer beware when going for off-brand TVs, since they may or may not be worth it in the end, even if they do save you money. When we get into PC monitors, it gets even higher price-wise. Looking on Newegg, I'm seeing some name-brand 28-inch IPS 4K displays with around a 5 millisecond response time going for around $400. One name brand with a 1 millisecond response time is $430 for a 28-inch screen. That's anywhere from paying $14.29 to $15.36 per inch of display. These are hefty prices to pay just for the displays. We also have to figure in, console-wise, $400 for the PS4 Pro, and anywhere from $400 to $600 for the as-yet unknown price of Project Scorpio. So assuming someone is looking for the best budget 4K TV according to Ratings.com, and is planning on picking up the PS4 Pro, that's still at least $1,050, and anywhere from $1,050 to $1,250 if they are looking to use Project Scorpio when it is released. Obviously, there are cheaper 4K TVs that one could go with if they want, but with how thorough Ratings.com is with their testing, they're definitely a good place to look for TV recommendations. Plus, there's still some time left before Project Scorpio launches, so there may be cheaper 4K TVs with better response times by then as well. I will take this opportunity to mention that I will not be discussing buying multiple graphics cards and using them in tandem with each other for a 4K PC. The benefits and drawbacks of using multiple GPUs aren't really something I plan on getting into. But also, by buying multiple cheaper GPUs, say two GTX 1070s, it artificially raises the price of the PC, even if it could be done at a later time. While it is a viable option for some people, I'm going to be focusing on a single graphics card PC build here, since that's what the majority of builds out there are. Yes, enthusiasts with extra money do enjoy having 2 to 4 graphics cards working together, but they're not the mainstream of people building PCs, even in the gaming world. They're more common in the gaming world, but they're still not the majority. Also, there are still quite a few games on the market that do not take advantage of multiple graphics cards. Having said that, moving to the PC side, prices jump up even higher. As I mentioned before, the GTX 1080 Ti is the only single sub $1,000 video card on the market that can reliably hit native 4K resolution and maintain 60 FPS or better at max or near max settings on many newer AAA games. But the GTX 1080 Ti is a $700 video card minimum. That price is for the reference version, now known as the Founders Edition. If you want better cooling for the card, going to a board partner that offers better cooling and often factory overclocking on the GPU and VRAM is going to cost even more. Plus, you then need a motherboard and CPU that can handle the loads of 4K gaming. The very best consumer-grade Intel CPU for gaming right now is the recently released i7 7700K processor. The K variant of Intel processors means that they can be overclocked. However, many benchmarking people have said that the very slight gains over the i7 6700K might not be worth it to most people who already have the 6700K. Even so, the i7 7700K is still $340 by itself. If you're not interested in overclocking, the non-K variants of the processors are slightly cheaper. I should also point out that AMD's new Ryzen chips have been released. These generally offer similar power to certain Intel chips. As far as gaming goes, using a Ryzen chip of similar power to an Intel chip won't get you quite as many frames per second, but they are close. Also, since the Ryzen chips tend to be focusing more on the amount of cores and threads each core works at one time, you can get an 8-core, 16-thread Ryzen 1700 CPU for $315, which is less expensive than the i7 7700K, but not by much. And you will get double the cores and threads. It will be a workhorse for multi-processor, multi-thread applications like video and audio editing or streaming, even if it doesn't have the single-thread performance of the Intel chip, which is what helps the i7 in games. Motherboards that support these types of chips are another expense. I did find an MSI motherboard on Newegg that will support the 6700 and 7700 chips that is only $85, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that it also supports up to 64 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM at 2133 MHz. However, most of the other motherboards look to be running anywhere from $130 to $250, with the price ranging being based mostly on how much RAM and at what speed RAM it can support. Since we're talking about RAM, we might as well look into that as well. The newer processors support DDR4 RAM, as do the motherboards that support those processors. And DDR4 RAM is better than the older DDR3 RAM, so you would want that. In a 4K gaming PC, I would suggest no less than 16 gigabytes of RAM. Newegg is listing 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM anywhere from $57 per 8 gigabyte DIMM to around $210 for two 8 gigabyte DIMMs if you want RGB lighting on them. However, we have to remember that the RAM isn't always the same speed when we're looking at it. When building a PC, whether it is an entry-level 1080p gaming PC or an enthusiast-level 4K gaming PC, always match the RAM speeds to the motherboard being purchased. Also, never mix speeds or types of RAM, as in don't mix DDR3 and DDR4, and ensure that the motherboard can support as many DIMMs as you are buying, as well as the maximum amount of RAM the motherboard can support. For example, when I purchased my motherboard and RAM, I had to note that my motherboard could support 64 gigabytes of DDR4 2400 RAM, which I did max out at the time. I should also point out that my CPU is an i7-5820K 6-core LGA 2011 V3, so I had to buy a more expensive X99 motherboard to support that. The quad-core i7 motherboards are cheaper than what I had to buy to support 6 cores. Putting the wrong type or wrong speed RAM into the motherboard is just wasted time and money. So, assuming a 7700K at 340, 130 for a decent motherboard, 110 for 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, which will vary depending on the speed you're getting, $700 plus for the video card, and another $400 for the monitor, we're already at $1,680, and we haven't even added in the cost of a power supply, case, hard drives, Windows license, and CPU cooler. Once those are added in, the price could very well be approaching $1,900 or more, depending on how insane you go with the wattage of the power supply, the size of the case, amount and size of the hard drives, and if you go air cooling, all-in-one liquid cooling, or even all-out with a custom water loop. But therein lies an advantage of PC gaming: scalability. You can go with just what you need or balls to the wall if you have the money to burn. For example, when I built my PC, I had some extra money to burn, so I went all out. A 6-core i7 and motherboard that supported it, 64 gigabytes DDR4 RAM, 11 terabytes of storage split between two 5 terabyte 7200 RPM drives and a 1 terabyte SSD, and a hybrid GTX 980 Ti, which was top of the line at the time, a 1000 watt power supply, and a giant case. After the 1080p 144Hz monitor, taxes, and shipping, my PC ran around $2,500, maybe more. But my PC isn't a 4K gaming beast. It was built for both great 1080p gaming at high frame rates and max settings, streaming, and for video editing, which I've been slacking on, I do admit. My 980 Ti can render some games at 4K max settings, mostly older titles like Diablo 3, and then super sample them down to 1080p while maintaining high frame rates. But it certainly can't run Battlefield 1 at native 4K and at least 60 frames per second at max settings. But even so, I could upgrade my video card if I wanted to. I could upgrade my CPU if I wanted to. I've maxed out my motherboard's RAM though. I could add another 980 Ti video card and run them in SLI if I wanted to. That's the benefit of scalability and the ability to upgrade. I can choose if and when I upgrade certain parts of my PC or the entire thing. So the 4K consoles have a cost advantage, even with how expensive 4K TVs are, provided you aren't going for the 70-inch OLED monster from LG. But PCs have the advantage of scalability and upgradability. Even a $500 to $750 PC can get upgrades to perform better, though its ability to be upgraded to the max would most likely require building a new PC. Also, any PC has many more uses than just gaming, such as productivity and office suites as an example, editing videos or audio, better web browsing than the consoles could ever hope for, etc. So buying or building a PC has that advantage as well. So far, the main pros and cons have been focused around price of the hardware and the scalability of PCs. However, both consoles and PCs have other advantages and disadvantages over each other. One advantage of console gaming is the ability to sit at the couch or in a nice recliner and play your games. Generally, the living room or gaming room also has more space for a larger screen. Party games are far easier to do with friends on a console in a larger room, especially on Nintendo consoles, but even the Sony and Microsoft consoles have party games. It's a bit harder to sit at a desk with a recliner or a sofa, and party games really aren't a big thing on PC. The PC, though, has a huge advantage when it comes to the sheer amount of games available. Thanks to Windows having backwards compatibility with older versions, even some games released before the millennium can still work on Windows 7, 8, and 10. The indie scene is enormous on the PC as well. Plus, most AAA games released by third parties on consoles are also on the PC. And even Microsoft's newer Xbox first-party games are available on the PC at no extra cost through their Play Anywhere initiative. In short, there are thousands upon thousands of games of just about any type one can imagine on the PC. This also brings up that there are multiple storefronts to buy digitally on the PC, such as Steam, Good Old Games, and the Windows Store, and even third-party publisher storefronts like Uplay and Origin. Buying digitally on the consoles forces you into the Xbox or PlayStation stores only. There are also a ton of cheap or cheaper games on the PC. What about exclusives, though? Well, I will be one to say to look for exclusives on a console when going to decide on a purchase, but I will also admit that with the exception of Nintendo consoles, people don't often buy consoles based solely off exclusives, especially in the mainstream. For example, for the first 3 years of its release, the PS4 had very lackluster and/or very few exclusives, but multi-platform games ran better on it overall than on the Xbox One. Also, Sony was able to get some exclusive deals that Microsoft previously had, like the Call of Duty map packs coming out 30 days earlier on the PS4. As a result, the PS4 sold better. We can also chalk that up to Microsoft's horrendous messaging, especially early on with the Xbox One. But as for the exclusives on those consoles, well, if we look at the top 20 overall game sales of 2016 by NPD, which doesn't include digital copies, only physical ones, exactly 0 first-party Sony games made it onto that list. Also, exactly 0 Microsoft first-party games made it onto the list. So despite Uncharted 4's healthy sales of over 8 million units, it still didn't break into the top 20 of overall game sales. So all the calls of exclusives are what cause consoles to sell are pretty much bullshit in the grand scheme of things. Except for Nintendo consoles, where the majority of games sold on Nintendo consoles since the N64 are first-party games. Uncharted 4 is only on around 13% of the PS4s out there, and Horizon Zero Dawn is only on around 5%. Microsoft is in a similar situation with exclusives like Halo, Gears of War, and Forza. While early adopters will often gravitate towards exclusives that interest them, the mainstream gamer cares very little about exclusives overall. While digital sales are increasing, they aren't counted by anyone except the publisher, and they're still not the mainstream of gaming on consoles. And you can bet your bottom dollar that if Horizon, Uncharted, Halo, or Gears sold millions upon millions of units digitally, Sony and Microsoft would be shouting that from the rooftops. Your average console gamer still prefers physical media that they can trade in at a later date when a new game comes out and they aren't playing the older ones. Plus, if one wants to talk about the sheer amount of exclusives available, the PC wins there hands down. There are far more exclusives on the PC just from the indie titles alone than on any console. I will admit, though, that the indie scene is a much more niche market. While exclusive games can sell people who are early adopters in the console space, the much bigger factors for the mainstream is where the games are supposed to be better, if there's any other incentives, like the Call of Duty map pack timing, for example, and where their friends are playing that might push them towards one piece of console hardware over another. The control methods on each platform are far more subjective. Some people prefer controllers, others keyboard and mouse. There's no denying that people who are good with a keyboard and mouse, of which I am not one of them as the gameplay in the background shows, tends to be more accurate than those who are on controllers, but there are exceptions. PCs also can use any wired Xbox 360 controller or a plugged-in Xbox One controller in Windows 10 by default, and also the newer console controllers released with the Xbox One S controller or console do work through Bluetooth on your PCs automatically. Plus, PCs can also use DualShock 4s and even the Switch's Pro controller as well. Honestly, some people just prefer controllers. Yes, even for shooter games. Some people like that consoles are pretty much plug and play. Plug into the wall and into the TV and then Ethernet or connect to Wi-Fi and you're good to go. Building a PC is a bit more involved, but it is hardly the huge pain in the ass it was even 10 years ago. Everything's been streamlined, especially the CPU installation. Plus, there's plenty of tutorials online, video and written, for anyone to learn from. Or, if you're still intimidated, most local PC shops will only charge a nominal fee, like say $75 to $100, to build and test your PC for you. Also, I would suggest not buying pre-built gaming desktops from retailers, especially from brands like Alienware. They're often far overpriced for what you get, and you can also build the exact same thing, or close to it, yourself for far cheaper, just without the logo on the case. Just for giggles, I went to Alienware's site, and their most expensive gaming PC starts at $4,900, and it doesn't even have 7200 RPM drives in it, nor the option for them when purchasing. Sure, it has a 10-core i7 and a GTX 1080 Ti, but the rest of it really isn't all that worth it. I'm going to mention that the old joke about having to upgrade your PC every few months just to play the latest and greatest games that was very prevalent in the 90s and early 2000s doesn't hold any water these days. Intel and AMD aren't in the old megahertz wars anymore. Sure, newer generations of CPUs are faster than the older ones, but the rapid increase in speed has been replaced with working towards more cores and threads, as well as better power efficiency and heat dissipation. While video cards are still going strong in power increases, developers are still making games that can run on around 5-year-old GPUs. Even a game like The Division only has a recommended graphics card of a GTX 970, with a minimum spec of a GTX 560. Sure, games won't look great on the really old cards, but many of them will still play. So the old advantage of consoles lasting longer than PCs isn't there today. Sure, consoles get greater optimization because they don't need to worry about hundreds of configurations, but even with that optimization, they're still optimizing for older hardware. However, this optimization on consoles can't be completely left out, even if it is for older tech. The fact that consoles are a fixed platform is both a pro and a con for them. It's a pro in the fact that because developers know the hardware is fixed, they can develop specifically for that hardware and attempt to maximize performance for that hardware. Also, since consoles aren't running operating systems that have to deal with the myriad of programs that could potentially be running on a PC at any given time, they are often only keep one main program in memory and then a few smaller background processes. The OS in each console is much more streamlined. This allows developers to program much closer to the metal, as it is known, or going for maximum performance based on the hardware without the OS holding them back. But it is also a con in the fact that developers can't add in bells and whistles for those with more powerful hardware and then scale back to lower level hardware. Though we'll see if this changes with the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio. Developers are also stuck with a fixed amount of RAM. Consoles use what is known as a unified memory architecture. They have a set amount of RAM, but part of that RAM is unavailable to developers. A certain amount is set aside for the OS of the consoles. In the PS4 and the PS4 Pro, out of the 8 gigabytes of RAM in the console, the 3 gigabytes is set aside for the console's OS, leaving developers 5 gigabytes of RAM. On the original Xbox One and Xbox One S, 3.5 gigabytes is set aside for the OS, leaving only 4.5 available to developers. Project Scorpio, though, has a total of 12 gigabytes of RAM, with 4 gigabytes for the OS and 8 gigabytes for developers, which is a healthy increase. However, the RAM allocated to developers is used for everything, not just graphics. So the RAM is used for sound, graphics, and communicating with the CPU for things like AI and any other calls that the CPU makes in each game. PCs only have this issue when someone is using the built-in graphics on their motherboard. When using a discrete graphics card, the VRAM on the graphics card is used for graphics, while the main system memory is used for the sound, AI, etc. Obviously, some of the main system RAM is used for tasks the OS is running and for any programs open in the background, but most modern PCs are built with enough RAM to handle that and run a game pretty easily. Another advantage PCs have is the ability to overclock. The CPUs and GPUs can often be overclocked, giving them an extra amount of speed. This speed equates to extra performance. On newer Intel chips, this would be the K variants, while I believe all Ryzen chips are able to be overclocked out of the box, but I'm not exactly sure. Most board partner GPU manufacturers' graphics cards come with software that lets you overclock the GPU and memory, and this is after their own factory overclocks over their reference models. Is overclocking necessary? No. I don't overclock my system at all, and I have no issues in games or productivity suites. And I don't recommend that people who haven't overclocked do it without looking up how to do it safely. That's a lot of money to be throwing away if the overclock goes wrong and a component burns out. But this is an option if one wants. Now again, I'm not going to try and say one platform is better for you over another. Everyone is different. But as someone who games on both the PC and consoles, I like having both. And I don't really see much of a reason for people to not at least try both out. Sure, there's major differences between the platforms. But, for example, I enjoy playing 2016 Dooms and the Quake Champion beta used in the background here at 1080p ultra settings at around 100 frames per second on my PC. While I also enjoy doing multiplayer with friends on my Xbox One, or spending over 155 hours exploring Hyrule on my Switch. There's a bit of something for me on both the PC and consoles, so why not game on both? But maybe I'm weird. There are definitely a lot of people who prefer one or the other. I'd probably prefer PC more if I had more friends playing on PC, but I also enjoy being able to sit back and play in comfort with a controller in hand to play some games. Each platform has some advantages and some disadvantages. If your main concern is graphical fidelity and the speed and accuracy of a mouse and keyboard, the scalability and upgradability, then a PC with nice hardware is the way to go. If you prefer sitting on the couch, controller in hand, or playing party games, consoles will do you far better. I find the time to do both. For me, I can enjoy both, so why not game on both? I would also like to point out that personally, I would much rather have 1080p or 1440p gaming at nice high frame rates over 4K resolution at a lower frame rate. Yes, I'm one of those frame rate whores. But seriously, once you can actually see games moving at well over 60 frames per second, which requires a display that has a higher than 60 Hz refresh rate, you never want to go back. The gameplay you were seeing in the background is only playing at 60 frames per second, because that's what Shadowplay records at. However, the actual Quake Champions beta was running at around 100 FPS at ultra settings on my 1080p 144Hz monitor. While you can get 144Hz 4K PC monitors, there aren't a whole lot of games or graphics cards that can push those sorts of frames per second right now. I'm not even sure Nvidia's $1,200 Titan XP can do so without being an SLI. As for 4K TVs, most are 60 Hz right now, so the best that the PS4 or PS4 Pro or Project Scorpio could even try for is 4K 60 FPS, and I wouldn't expect a ton of games on either system to be running that. When I switched back to my Xbox One for Gears of War 4, finishing the campaign at 30 FPS just felt so wrong, after playing the campaign at around 90 FPS on my PC at ultra settings. This is also why I'm considering waiting for the PC version of Destiny 2 before I even consider buying it. Since Destiny can't run 60 FPS on the PS4 Pro, and since it most likely won't run at 60 FPS on Scorpio, to keep the multiplayer the same as 30 FPS as the Xbox One version. If I pick it up, it will most likely be the PC version when it comes out. On the PC, I can easily get at least 60 FPS at 1080p ultra settings with my 980 Ti. A smoother frame rate in the end is much more important to me than 4K resolution. I don't have a 4K TV or a 4K monitor right now, and unless the response times on the 4K TVs improve dramatically, as well as the prices improving dramatically, I can't see myself buying one before well into next year. However, I'll discuss this more in my next video, where I will be talking about my thoughts on both the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio, where I'm hoping they will lead in the console space, and what I'd rather see with them as a 1080p gamer for the foreseeable future. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you liked it, please hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. Either way, I'm good. Also, if you enjoyed the video and wish to help support in making more, consider visiting my Patreon page located in the description below. And again, thank you very much.